Do you know what 10,000 pounds of pressure per square inch feels like? It feels like the entire world is trying to crush you into a single atom. My name is Elias. I am the sonar operator for the DSV Nereus. We are currently 35,000 feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. It's pitch black outside our viewport. We came down here to find a new species of deep-sea biology. Instead, we found a rusted Soviet nuclear submarine that went missing 40 years ago. It should be a dead metal tomb. But my sonar screen is covered in red dots. There is movement inside. And 5 minutes ago, someone knocked on our titanium hull. From the outside, the descent took 4 hours. Inside the Nereus, the air smelled of recycled oxygen, electrical grease, and nervous sweat. We were a crew of 3, Captain Vance, our pilot, Dr. Reese, the marine biologist, and me, Elias, on sonar and comms. The surface was a memory. The pressure gauge read 15,000 psi. If the hull suffered even a microscopic fracture, the water would slice through us like a supersonic razor blade before we even registered the pain. "External lights on," Vance commanded, his voice tight. 4 massive tungsten halogen lamps pierced the eternal night of the trench. The water wasn't clear. It was thick with marine snow, falling organic debris that looked like a slow-motion blizzard. "Elias, what are you seeing on the acoustic array?" Vance asked. I stared at the green sweep of my monitor. "Nothing but static, Captain. The sea floor is flat. Wait, I've got a massive shadow at bearing 0 to 0. It wasn't a whale. It wasn't a hydrothermal vent. It was perfectly cylindrical, roughly 300 feet long. "Take us in closer," Reese whispered, pressing her face against the thick acrylic viewport. As the Nereus glided through the icy water, the shape materialized in our floodlights. It was a submarine. Massive, heavily rusted, and completely silent. It was resting on a bed of pale, eyeless tube worms. "My God," Vance breathed. "Look at the tail fin. That's a Soviet Aquila class." "Elias, ping it," Vance ordered. "Active sonar. Let's map the wreckage." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the console. Pinging a dead nuclear sub in an uncharted trench felt like shouting in a graveyard. I pressed the button. Ping. The high-frequency sound wave shot out into the dark water, bouncing off the rusted titanium hull of the Soviet beast. The return echo painted a 3D wireframe on my screen. "Captain," my voice cracked. "The hull is intact, but the internal layout. It's wrong." I pointed at the sonar display. The compartments inside the K440 weren't filled with water. The sonar was registering pockets of air. "That's impossible," Ares said, adjusting her glasses. "After 40 years, the seals would have rotted. The pressure would have collapsed it. Then the green sweep of the sonar screen refreshed. A bright red dot appeared in the center of the Soviet sub's forward torpedo room. "We have a biological contact," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Something is inside." The sweep refreshed again. Now there were 2 dots, then 4, then 20. The entire forward section of the dead submarine was swarming with movement. "They're not fish," I whispered, watching the erratic, jerky movements of the red blips. "The acoustic signature. It's heavy. Too heavy for deep-sea life." Suddenly, the VHF radio on my console sparked to life. It shouldn't have been possible. Radio waves don't travel through deep water, and we were untethered. But the speaker crackled with a thick, heavy static. Through the static, a voice emerged. It was Russian. It sounded old, distorted, and incredibly tired. But the most terrifying part wasn't the language. It was the sound behind the voice. Every time the man spoke, there was a wet, gurgling noise, like he was trying to talk with a mouth full of thick mud. "Puss tight, Nas," the voice pleaded through the radio. Eris spoke a little Russian. She went pale. "He's saying, 'Let us in.'" Thud, thud. We all jumped. The sound didn't come from the radio. It came from the physical hull of our own submarine. Something heavy and metallic was striking the outer titanium shell. "External cameras," Vance yelled. I punched the keyboard, switching the main monitor to the aft camera feed. Standing on the exterior hull of the Nereus, 35,000 feet underwater, was a figure in a heavy canvas and brass diving suit from the 1980s. The suit was completely deflated, crushed flat by the pressure. But the heavy brass helmet turned, looking directly into our camera. I stared at the monitor, my blood freezing in my veins. The canvas and brass diving suit on the camera feed was completely crushed. It was less than 3 inches thick. At 15,000 psi, human bones don't just break, they turn into dust. Flesh turns into a liquid paste. There was absolutely no way a human being could be alive inside that flattened canvas suit. Yet, the heavy brass helmet slowly tilted downward, staring through the camera lens directly into my eyes. Thud, thud. It raised a flattened, brass-weighted glove and struck our hull again. The sound echoed through our tiny cabin like a death knell. "Vance, get it off us!" Dr. Aris screamed, backing away from the viewport. Captain Vance's hands flew across the control yoke. "Engaging lateral thrusters. Hold on." The Nereus violently lurched to the port side, the electric engines whining in protest against the crushing pressure of the water. The sudden movement stirred up a massive cloud of pale, blinding silt from the ocean floor. The external camera feed became a swirl of gray mud. Did we shake it? Vance asked, his knuckles white on the controls. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and checked the camera monitor as the silt began to settle. The crushed suit was still there. It had gripped the external titanium handrail with unnatural, terrifying strength. "It's not letting go," I whispered. Then the flattened figure began to crawl forward along the top of our hull, moving like a grotesque, mechanical spider. It was heading straight for our external power junction. "It knows the layout of a submersible," Eris realized, her voice trembling. "Elias, they aren't just dead sailors. The pressure down here, it didn't just crush them. It fused whatever was left of their consciousness into the metal." Through the camera, I watched the flattened glove reach down and grip the thick, rubberized power cables that fed our external floodlights. "No, no, no," Vance muttered, trying to pitch the sub upwards, but it was too late. With a single, brutal yank, the figure ripped the cables right out of the socket. The 4 massive tungsten halogen lamps outside instantly died. The ocean swallowed us in absolute, impenetrable blackness. Inside the cabin, the primary lights shorted out. The emergency backup generator kicked in, bathing our claustrophobic metal sphere in a harsh, pulsing red glow. "We are blind," Vance said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "Elias." "The sonar. Tell me what's out there." I turned back to my green acoustic screen. What I saw made my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. The single red dot on the hull was the least of our problems. The massive wreck of the Soviet K440 was entirely lit up. Dozens of red dots were pouring out of the submarine's rusted torpedo tubes. They weren't swimming. They were walking. Walking across the ocean floor at 35,000 feet, heading directly toward the Nereus. The VHF radio exploded with static again. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was a chorus of wet, gurgling, distorted Russian voices, overlapping and bleeding into one another. The translation software on my computer struggled to keep up, printing words onto my screen in real time. Cold. So heavy. Need the air. Let us decompress. Open the door. They were drowning, and they had been drowning for 40 years. Fang. Thud. Scrape. The sounds hit us from all sides. Left, right, above, and below. Multiple heavy metallic impacts struck the titanium hull of the Nereus. They were swarming us. The sonar screen was a solid mass of red contacts. Dozens of crushed, empty diving suits and fused bodies were crawling over our vessel, dragging their heavy brass boots across the metal. They were looking for a way in. Suddenly, a high-pitched automated alarm began to shriek inside our cabin. Warning. Hull integrity compromised. Microfracture detected. Vance and I spun around. Dr. Aris was pressed against the back wall, pointing a trembling finger at the main acrylic viewport. A tiny hairline crack had appeared in the thick glass, but water wasn't spraying in under extreme pressure. Instead, a thick, freezing, black sludge was slowly oozing through the crack, dripping onto the cabin floor. The black sludge dripping from the hairline crack wasn't water. It was thick, freezing, and smelled overpoweringly of rusted iron, decaying algae, and old blood. It hit the metal floor of our cabin with heavy, rhythmic splatters. Drip, drip, drip. Dr. Aries backed away, her eyes wide with terror. "It's the biomass," she whispered. "The pressure at 35,000 feet doesn't let things rot properly. It compresses them into this." The automated voice of the Nereus cut through the red emergency lights. "A warning. Cabin pressure increasing. Compromise imminent." The crack in the acrylic viewport wasn't shattering inward, but it was widening by microscopic increments. The external pressure was trying to force the entire ocean through a gap the size of a human hair. "Vance, we need to blow the ballast tanks now," I yelled over the shrieking alarms. If we could drop our heavy steel weights, the natural buoyancy of our titanium sphere might shoot us up to the surface like a cork. Captain Vance's hands were a blur across the control yoke, but his face was ashen. "I'm trying, Elias. The manual release is jammed. They're holding us down." I spun back to the sonar screen. The swarm of red dots wasn't just crawling over us anymore. They were clustered around the heavy steel ballast tanks on the underbelly of our sub. The crushed, fused sailors from the K-440 were physically clinging to our weights, adding their own dead mass to keep us pinned to the ocean floor. They didn't want us to leave. They wanted to drag us into the dark with them. The VHF radio crackled violently again. The chorus of distorted Russian voices faded, replaced by a single, clear transmission in perfect, unaccented English. It sounded exactly like Captain Vance. "Open the hatch, Elias. We just want to breathe. It's so heavy down here." Open the hatch. The real Vance was sitting 3 feet away from me, his jaw clenched, staring out the cracked viewport. The ocean was learning how to mimic us. The black sludge on the floor began to pool, spreading outward like an oil slick. But it didn't just pool. It began to rise. The thick liquid defied gravity, pulling itself upward into the shape of a jagged humanoid figure. "Aris, get back!" I yelled, unbuckling from my chair and grabbing a heavy emergency wrench from the wall bracket. The sludge creature didn't have eyes or a mouth, but it turned its featureless, dripping head toward Dr. Nereus. It lunged, its arm extending like a whip of black tar. It wrapped around Arisa's ankle. She screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, as the freezing cold substance instantly burned through her jumpsuit. It was trying to pull her toward the crack in the glass. It was trying to pull her outside. I swung the heavy steel wrench with everything I had. It passed right through the creature's arm with a wet squelch, severing the connection. The sludge collapsed back into a puddle, releasing Nereus. But the moment the metal wrench touched the black fluid, the steel handle instantly rusted, corroding into orange flakes in my hands. It was hyper-accelerating the decay of anything it touched. The manual overrides. Vance suddenly shouted, pointing to a heavy red lever on the ceiling of the cabin, encased in a glass box. If we pull the emergency jettison, it drops the entire external carriage batteries, thrusters, everything. We'll lose all power, but the sphere will shoot to the surface. It was a suicide maneuver. We would be adrift on the ocean surface with no comms, but it was our only chance. Do it! I screamed, helping Nereus to her feet. Vance reached up, grabbed the heavy red fire extinguisher, and smashed the glass box. He grabbed the red lever, but outside the viewport, in the pitch-black water, a massive, pale, bioluminescent face suddenly pressed itself against the cracked acrylic glass. It wasn't a human face. It was impossibly huge, with glowing, pupil-less white eyes the size of dinner plates, and rows of translucent, needle-like teeth. The face outside the glass was older than humanity. It was pale, bioluminescent, and impossibly colossal. The white, pupil-less eyes stared into our tiny cabin with an ancient, starving intelligence. The crushed Soviet sailors weren't the ones hunting us. They were the bait. They were parasitic extensions of this massive benthic god, used like anglerfish lures to drag fresh meat down into the trench. The creature unhinged a jaw lined with thousands of translucent needle-like teeth. It let out a soundless roar, a low-frequency vibration, so powerful that the thick acrylic viewport spider-webbed. With a sickening crack, the black sludge inside our cabin instantly reacted, rising up like a striking cobra. Pull it. Pull the lever. Reese screamed over the deafening blare of the pressure alarms. Vance didn't hesitate. He yanked the heavy red emergency jettison lever downward with both hands. Outside the hall, 12 explosive bolts detonated simultaneously. The Nereus violently shed its external carriage. The heavy steel ballast tanks, the massive battery banks, and the electric thrusters were blown away. Freed from the dead weight and the grip of the Soviet ghosts, our titanium sphere shot upward like a bullet. The Gi force threw us to the floor. The cabin plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness as the primary power died, leaving only the dying red in an emergency bulb. But the ascent wasn't smooth. The sphere violently shuddered. The massive creature had clamped its jaws around the lower half of our titanium shell. It was trying to drag us back down into the crushing dark. We're too heavy. I yelled, watching the depth gauge stall at 30,000 feet. The creature was fighting our buoyancy. Inside the cabin, the black sludge realized its host was losing. It expanded, boiling in the changing pressure. It didn't go for me or Arice. It lunged directly at Captain Vance, wrapping around his legs and dragging him toward the spider-webbed glass. Vance! I grabbed his arms, planting my boots against the metal console. Arice grabbed his belt. We pulled with everything we had, but the sludge was impossibly strong, digesting the fabric of his uniform. Let go, Elias, Vance gasped, his face pale, his lower half completely engulfed in the freezing black tar. "It needs the biomass. It won't let the ship go unless it feeds." Before I could argue, Vance ripped his hands from my grip. He threw his own body weight forward, driving his shoulder directly into the black sludge and pressing himself against the freezing, cracked viewport. The creature outside felt the shift in biomass. The massive jaws released the titanium hull to swallow the lower carriage whole. Instantly, the Nereus broke free, rocketing upward at a terrifying speed. The rapid ascent was a blur of agonizing pressure changes and absolute darkness. Haris and I lay on the floor, bleeding from our noses and ears as the bends threatened to tear our blood vessels apart. We watched in horror as the black sludge entirely consumed Captain Vance, dissolving him into the dark liquid before turning completely rigid and dormant as we hit the warmer, low-pressure waters of the shallows. BOOM. The titanium sphere breached the surface of the Pacific Ocean, bobbing violently in the sunlight. We tore open the top hatch. The blinding, glorious sun hit my face, accompanied by the smell of fresh, salty sea air. The nightmare was below us. 3 hours later, a Coast Guard cutter picked up our emergency beacon. They pulled Haris and me out of the metal sphere, but there was no trace of Vance, not even his clothes. They classified the Nereus disaster as a catastrophic mechanical failure. Haris quit marine biology and moved to a landlocked state. I still live near the coast, but I can't sleep in silence anymore. I have permanent tinnitus from the pressure change. But in the dead of night, the ringing in my ears doesn't sound like static. It sounds like heavy, brass boots on a metal hull, and a chorus of Russian voices begging me to let them in. The end.